The stopwatch lay heavy in the timer's hand, a silver eye reflecting the high plains sun. Below, in the dusty arena of the Sanctuary Gulch annual cutting trials, a compact sorrel colt, no bigger than a yearling, held a nervous heifer pinned against the far fence. The colt moved with a liquid intelligence, a mirror to the cow's feints and dodges, his scarred, frost-nipped ears twitching with concentration. In the stands, Silas Blackwood, whose sprawling cattle empire and high-dollar quarter horses defined the county's wealth, leaned forward. His jaw was a knot of muscle. The perfect pampered colt he had entered, a specimen of shimmering pedigree worth more than most men's homes, had already been disqualified, baffled and spooked by the same brash heifer. Now this runt, sired by a ghost, was putting on a masterclass. The crowd, once his chorus of admirers, was silent, their gaze fixed on the small horse and the still woman who stood by the gate. Ilara Kane did not watch the colt. She knew what he could do. She watched Blackwood. She watched the slow curdling of his pride, the tightening around his eyes that was the only sign of the fury within. Years ago, after the great blizzard, after she had lost her husband and refused to lose her home, they had called her the Blizzard Widow. They had called her a fool, an unfortunate grief-addled woman clinging to a lost cause. The pity had been a heavier burden than the scorn. Now they watched her, and the pity was gone, replaced by a confusion that was slowly hardening into awe. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Yes, they had called her a fool. And it had all started 4 years earlier in the white hell of the late spring blizzard of '78. The snow hadn't come as a gentle dusting, but as a solid wall of white falling from a sky the colour of a fresh bruise. It fell for 2 days and 3 nights, erasing roads, burying fences, and turning the familiar rolling landscape into a treacherous alien sea of drifts. Ilara had been a widow for just over a year. David lost to a tractor rollover the previous spring. The town's collective wisdom, delivered in casseroles and sympathetic glances, was for her to sell the small 160-acre homestead to Blackwood, take the money, and move to a tidy house in town. It was the sensible thing to do. One woman alone was a sentence, not a beginning. But Ilara's grief had forged in her a stubbornness that grew best in poor soil. She stayed. When the blizzard hit, she had one calf unaccounted for, a late-born stray from her tiny herd of 10. On the third morning, with the snow finally stopped and the world aching under a pristine, blinding sun, she saddled her old mare and went out. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of her saddle lever and the plosive sigh of her mare's breath. She found the calf, frozen solid in the lee of a collapsed shed, a small, hard sculpture of lost money and lost hope. The cold arithmetic of ranching was unforgiving. So many head, so much feed, so many days of work, and it could all be wiped out by a few degrees of temperature. She was turning for home, a hollowness inside her matching the vast empty landscape, when she saw the spot of colour against the towering drift near the creek. It was a patch of dark hide, a mare, clearly dead, her legs sticking out at stiff, unnatural angles. Wild horses, mustangs that still roamed the high ridges, sometimes drifted down in hard weather. As she drew closer, a flicker of movement near the mare's belly caught her eye. It wasn't the wind. Dismounting, her boots sinking deep into the powder, she found it. A foal, no more than a day or 2 old, half buried and frozen to its mother's cold flank. Its coat was a pale, icy buckskin, caked with snow and frozen blood. Its eyes were sealed shut with ice, and its breath was a barely perceptible puff of vapour, a dying signal. One person alone, the phrase echoed in her head. She was one person alone, and here was another. Something in her refused to let it lie. It was an act of sheer, uncalculated defiance against the cold, against the loss, against the sensible advice of the entire world. She took out the knife she carried for cutting twine, the blade numbingly cold in her gloved hand. She had to chip the foal free from its mother's hair, the frozen connection a grim umbilical. It was light, terrifyingly light, a bundle of sticks and ice. She unbuttoned her heavy canvas coat, the wind biting through her layers instantly, and tucked the foal inside against her warmth, its sharp, frozen little hooves digging into her ribs. The trek back to the barn was the longest of her life, each step a prayer, the tiny, fragile life an agonizing weight against her own heart. In the warmth of the barn, under the glow of a single bare bulb, the full extent of the damage was laid bare. The foal lay on a bed of clean straw, shivering violently. Its ears were waxy and white at the tips, the delicate cartilage already dead from the frost. Its legs were stiff, its joints swollen. She rubbed it with rough burlap sacks, forcing circulation into the frozen limbs, forcing it to live. She milked her one dairy cow, her own hands clumsy and numb, and patiently worked the warm, rich milk past its lips with her finger. The next day, she managed to get the old truck started, and, with the foal wrapped in every blanket she owned, drove the treacherous road to the vet in Sanctuary Gulch. Doc Miller, a man whose pragmatism was as worn as his leather bag, took one look. "Elara," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "he's a wreck. Severe frostbite to the ears and muzzle, likely joint damage, probably has fluid in the lungs. You see this?" He pointed to the foal's unfocused, wandering eyes. "Neurological damage from the hypoxia. His brain was starved of oxygen." He sighed, the sound of a man delivering a familiar, unpleasant truth. "The kindest thing, the most practical thing, is to put him down. He'll never be right." A few other ranchers in town for supplies after the storm had gathered at the door. Their faces were a mixture of pity for her and a kind of grim satisfaction in their own correct judgment. One of them, a foreman from Blackwood's ranch, spoke up. "That's a wildie, isn't it? Not even worth a bullet. But I suppose it's the principle." Just then, Silas Blackwood himself walked in, shaking snow from his immaculate Stetson. He took in the scene, the huddled foal, the solemn vet, the pitiable widow. His voice was rich with false warmth. "Elara, my dear, a tough storm. I heard you lost a few head." His eyes flicked to the foal, a flicker of distaste crossing his features. "Doc's right. No sense throwing good money after bad. Tell you what." He pulled a worn billfold from his coat. "I'll give you $10 for the hide. My men can handle the rest." The air in the small clinic grew still. $10. The price of a carcass. It wasn't an offer. It was a pronouncement. It was the cold arithmetic of the ledger, a neat closing of an account deemed unprofitable. The other ranchers nodded. It was generous, really, more than the thing was worth. Elara looked from Blackwood's smooth, confident face to the foal. The tiny horse had managed to struggle to its feet, its legs trembling, its head hanging low. It took a single wobbly step toward her and leaned its body against her leg, a desperate, instinctual search for warmth and safety. Its whole life, a $10 problem to be disposed of. She looked back at Blackwood. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but as solid as granite. "No, thank you, Silas." She paid Doc Miller for the medicine he'd prescribed, a $50 expense she couldn't afford. She lifted the foal back into her truck. As she drove away, she could feel their eyes on her back, the weight of their judgment. The blizzard widow throwing away good money on a broken thing. The consensus was clear. Grief had finally made her mad. It was always easier to call a thing a curse than to admit you had misjudged a blessing. The first few weeks were a blur of the warm arithmetic of breath and bone. Ilara moved the foal into a spare stall in the barn, sectioned off and deeply bedded with the cleanest straw. She slept there herself on a cot, waking every 2 hours to the insistent alarm of an old wind-up clock. Each time she would milk the cow, warm the milk on a small camp stove, and patiently coax the foal to drink. It was a grueling, relentless cycle of labor, fueled by coffee and a defiant resolve that she didn't fully understand herself. Her world shrank to the dimensions of that stall, the sweet smell of milk and hay, the sharp tang of the liniment she rubbed into the foal's swollen joints, the soft, rasping sound of his breathing. She was no longer just a widow, a figure of pity in the community's collective gaze. She was a guardian. One person alone had become a purpose. The grief that had hollowed her out for a year was beginning to be filled, ounce by ounce, with the demands of this fragile life. Her nearest neighbour, a mile down the dirt road, was Mr. Alexei. He was an old man who had come from somewhere cold and hard. Russia, Poland, no one was quite sure. Decades ago, with nothing but a strange accent and a knowledge of sugar beets. He kept to himself, worked his small plot with a quiet intensity, and was regarded by the townsfolk as an eccentric relic. He had seen hardship in his life, and it had given him an ability to see past the surface of things. One afternoon, he appeared at her fence line, a stout figure in patched overalls, holding a small burlap sack. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The men in town, they talk," he said, his English clipped and guttural. "They say you keep a dying thing." Ilara straightened up from mucking the stall, leaning on her pitchfork. "He's not dying." Alexei's eyes, pale blue and surrounded by a web of wrinkles, scanned her face, then moved to the barn. "May I?" She nodded. He followed her inside, his boots making soft thuds on the packed earth floor. He stood before the stall for a long moment, watching the foal, who now stood on shaky but straightening legs. The colt's ears were a mess, the tips blackened and ragged, giving him a perpetually startled and slightly comical look. He walked with a stiffness that hinted at the deep ache still in his joints. Alexei reached a gnarled hand over the gate, not to touch the colt, but just to hold it in the air near him. The foal, instead of shying away, took a hesitant step forward and sniffed his fingers. Alexei grunted, a sound of satisfaction. He looked at the colt's ears, then at Ilara's tired face. "The frost that bites the blossom," he said slowly, each word a carefully placed stone, "makes the root go deep." He then opened his sack and produced 2 clay jars. "For the joints, my grandmother's recipe, from the old country." It was a thick, pungent salve that smelled of pine sap and comfrey. "And this," he said, handing her the second jar, "is for you. Beet kvass, good for the blood. You are thin." He turned and left without another word. Ilara stood there, holding the jars, the old man's aphorism echoing in the quiet barn. "The frost that bites the blossom makes the root go deep." It wasn't just about the foal. It was about her. It was the first time someone had looked at her and seen strength instead of damage. It was a week later that she gained another ally. A boy named Finn started appearing. He was one of the Miller kids from down the valley, the youngest of 7, a scruffy, silent child who was mostly overlooked in the chaos of his own home. He would stand at the fence for hours, a small, still figure, just watching. Ilara, accustomed to being watched and judged, ignored him at first, but his attention wasn't on her. It was on the colt. One day she was leading the foal on a short walk in the paddock when the boy spoke, his voice so quiet it was almost part of the wind. "He needs a name." Ilara stopped. "What's your name?" "Finn." "Well, Finn, what do you think his name should be?" The boy considered this with the gravity of a great philosopher. He looked at the colt's pale silvery coat and his ragged ears. "Frostbit," he said, with absolute certainty. It was a perfect name, a name that didn't hide the damage but wore it like a badge. It was honest. Frostbit, Ilara agreed. From then on, Finn was a regular presence. He never announced his arrival or his departure. He would just be there, sitting on the top rail of the fence, or sometimes, when he got braver, helping her muck the stall or fill the water trough. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a quiet vote of confidence. He was the only other person in Sanctuary Gulch who saw Frostbit not as a symbol of loss or foolishness, but simply as a horse. He brought the colt stolen apples, green and tart, and would whisper things to him that Ilara couldn't hear. He was the colt's first friend, and in a way, he was Ilara's too. The two of them, the old Russian farmer and the neglected boy, became her silent partners. They formed a tiny unspoken alliance of outsiders, a community of three built around a broken horse. Together, they would prove the cold arithmetic of Sanctuary Gulch wrong. Spring bled into a hot, dry summer. The land, recovering from the blizzard's deluge, baked under the relentless sun. The days fell into a rhythm of patient labour. Ilara rose before dawn, the sky a pale, soft grey, and began the chores. The work was methodical, unglamorous, and deeply satisfying. She treated Frostbit's legs with Alexi's pungent salve, the piney scent clinging to her hands and clothes. She measured out his feed, a careful mix of oats and supplements, a constant running calculation in her head. The cost of the feed, the cost of the vet bills, the cost of her time, all weighed against the dwindling savings from David's life insurance. It was the warm arithmetic of breath and bone, a ledger where the only entry that mattered was the steady, growing strength in the colt's legs. Finn was her shadow. He learned to anticipate her needs, handing her a currycomb before she asked, fetching a bucket of clean water, his small hands surprisingly capable. He talked to Frostbit in a low, continuous murmur, narrating his day, sharing secrets. Under the boy's gentle attention and Ilara's steady care, the colt began to transform. The stiffness in his walk lessened, replaced by a surprising fluidity. He was never going to be a big horse, the hardship of his first days had seen to that. He was compact, short-coupled, with a powerful hind end. His head was plain, and his frost-nipped ears gave him a slightly lopsided, curious expression. He was not beautiful by the standards of Silas Blackwood's show ring, but his eyes were different now. The initial dullness was gone, replaced by a startling, almost unnerving intelligence. He watched everything. He learned. Ilara started his training not with force, but with questions. She didn't break him. She invited him into a partnership. She taught him to yield to pressure, not from a rope, but from the slight shift of her weight. She taught him to stand, not tied to a post, but because she asked him to. It was a slow, quiet conversation between two beings who understood what it meant to be alone and underestimated. The first sign of what he truly was came one afternoon when Ilara's milk cow, a placid but stubborn Jersey, pushed through a weak spot in the fence and wandered into the hayfield. Ilara sighed, preparing for a long, frustrating chase. Frostbit, standing loose in the paddock, lifted his head. He watched the cow, then looked at Ilara, his strange ears cocked. Then, without any prompting, he trotted to the gap in the fence, circled wide around the cow, and with a series of quick, instinctive feints, gently but firmly nudged her back toward the corral. He moved not like a colt, but like a seasoned cutting horse, his body low to the ground, his movements economical and precise. He was reading the cow, anticipating her, thinking 2 steps ahead. Ilara stood frozen, the pitchfork she was holding forgotten in her hand. It was cow sense, an innate, almost mystical ability to understand and control cattle. It was the most prized and elusive trait in a cutting horse, something that could be encouraged but never truly taught. Some horses had it, most didn't. It was clear, watching the little buckskin colt work, that he had it in abundance. The frost hadn't just made his roots go deep, it seemed to have sharpened his mind, honed his instincts to a razor's edge. She kept it quiet. She knew what she had, and she knew the community was not ready to see it. It was one thing to be a pitiable widow caring for a crippled animal. It was another thing entirely to possess something of unique and mysterious value. Mockery could curdle into suspicion, and suspicion into something far uglier. So she banked her discovery like a fire coal under ash, keeping it warm and hidden, waiting for the right time. She bought a few scrawny calves at auction, telling anyone who asked that she was trying to build back her herd. In the evenings, in the privacy of her own round pen, away from the road and prying eyes, she worked with Frostbit, her and the horse and a single calf. It was a dance. The colt would drop his head, his eyes locked on the calf, and for a few moments he would cease to be a horse and become something else, a predator, a partner, a thinking machine made of muscle and bone. Finn was the only one who saw. He would sit on the top rail, his chin resting on his knees, watching in silent awe. "He's magic," he whispered one evening, as Frostbit held a particularly wily calf in the centre of the pen without ever touching it. "No, Finn," Ilara said, stroking the colt's sweaty neck. "He's not magic. He's smart. He remembers the cold." That autumn, Silas Blackwood saw her at the feed store in Sanctuary Gulch. He was holding court near the counter, his booming voice filling the dusty space. When he saw Ilara, he stopped mid-sentence and put on his mask of benevolent condescension. "Ilara, good to see you in town." He strode over, his polished boots loud on the wooden floor. "How's that project of yours coming along? Still got that blizzard runt?" The other men in the store fell quiet, listening. It was sport. "He's well, Silas," Ilara said, her voice level.
Good, good. Glad to hear it." He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, charitable tone. "Tell you what, I know you're a proud woman, but winter's coming. Feed prices are high. That thing is eating you out of house and home, I'd wager. I'll give you $100 for him. Right now. Cash. More than fair for an unregistered, damaged colt. Save you the winter feed bill. Think of it as a neighborly gesture." The offer hung in the air. $100. 10 times his original valuation, but still an insult. It was a price designed to reinforce his power and her poverty. It was the price of a nuisance, not a prospect. Ilara looked at him, her gaze so steady it seemed to unnerve him. She thought of Frostbit's intelligence, of the quiet dance in the round pen, of the coal banked under the ash. $100. It was the arithmetic of a man who saw only flaws, who confused price with value.
"No, thank you, Silas," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the finality of a closing door. "He's not for sale." She paid for her sack of oats and left, the silence in the store more damning than any laughter. She could feel Blackwood's irritation like a heat on her back. He was not a man accustomed to being told no, especially not by a woman he considered his dependent. Her refusal wasn't just a business decision. It was a challenge to the established order of things. She knew then that the quiet time was over. The coal was beginning to glow through the ash. The next 2 years passed in a cycle of patient work and hidden progress. Frostbit matured into a phenomenal cutting horse. Ilara, using the last of her savings, bought a well-bred but plain-looking mare from a dispersal sale and bred her to him. The resulting foal was born small, but with its sire's powerful hindquarters and intelligent eyes. The following year, she had 3 more foals on the ground. They were all tough, quick-footed, and uncannily smart. She sold 2 of them quietly to a rancher in the next county, a man who valued function over pedigree, for a fair price that put her accounts back in the black for the first time in years. She was no longer just surviving, she was building something. A small ranch, once a symbol of her tragic stubbornness, was becoming a quiet hub of activity. Finn, now a lanky teenager, was her right-hand man, his devotion to her and the horses absolute. He had a natural feel for the animals, the quiet confidence that they responded to. For Finn, the Kane place wasn't a charity case. It was the only real home he had ever known. Meanwhile, in the wider world of Sanctuary Gulch, Silas Blackwood's empire flourished. His horses, with their champion bloodlines and glossy coats, won ribbons and commanded astronomical prices. They were the equine embodiment of his own success, flawless, expensive, and bred for perfection.
Ranchers mortgaged their futures to buy one of his yearlings, hoping to catch some of his golden touch. The community's belief in Blackwood and his methods was absolute. Then came the reckoning. It didn't come in the form of a market crash or a rival breeder. It came, as it so often does in the high plains, from the sky and the dirt. It began with a wet, unseasonably warm winter that turned the pastures to mud, followed by a dry, hot spring. The conditions were perfect for the spread of disease. A virulent strain of scours, a diarrheal sickness that devastates young foals, swept through the county. It hit the big ranches the hardest. Blackwood's pristine, climate-controlled barns became incubators for the disease. His foals, born of pampered stock and raised in sterile environments, had no natural resistance. Their perfect genetics were no match for the gut-wrenching reality of the bacteria. They weakened and died in staggering numbers, their high-dollar pedigrees turning to worthless paper overnight.
The same thing was happening on every ranch that had invested in his bloodlines. The pursuit of perfection had created a fatal fragility. The news spread in hushed, panicked tones at the feed store and the post office. The county's entire horse industry, built in Blackwood's image, was collapsing. The man himself grew withdrawn, his usual booming confidence replaced by a grim, defensive silence. On Ilara's ranch, it was a different story. Her foals, born in the open pasture to a hardy, unpampered mare and sired by a horse who had survived being frozen solid, were thriving. Their immune systems, forged by their sire's legacy of hardship, fought off the sickness with little more than a few days of lethargy. They were not perfect, but they were resilient. They endured. The frost that bites the blossom makes the root go deep. Alexi's words had become a prophecy. At first no one noticed. The county was too consumed with its own disaster. But slowly the whispers started. The vet, Doc Miller, making his grim rounds from one stricken ranch to another, stopped by Ilara's place to check on an old cow. He saw the herd of healthy, energetic foals frolicking in the pasture. He stood there for a long time, his face a mask of disbelief. "How, Ilara?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Everyone else is getting wiped out. Blackwood's lost nearly his whole foal crop, but yours, they look perfect." "They're not perfect," Ilara corrected him gently. "They're hardy." The word spread. Hardy. In a world that had worshipped perfection, the word had a new and powerful resonance. The mockery that had followed Ilara for years began to curdle, first into grudging curiosity, then into outright suspicion. It wasn't natural, some said.
A woman, alone, with a line of horses descended from a half-dead wild colt, succeeding where the great Silas Blackwood had failed? It didn't compute. It was easier to believe a thing was witchcraft than to admit your entire worldview had been wrong. Ranchers started making excuses to drive past her property, slowing down to stare at the small, tough-looking horses in her pasture. They saw the distinctive buckskin and sorrel foals, all bearing the same intelligent head and powerful build. They saw the ragged-eared stallion, Frostbit, standing on a small rise, watching over his herd with a calm, regal authority. The fortune inversion was complete. The object of pity had become the subject of envy. The scorned and broken had endured where the pampered and proud had fallen. The balance of power in Sanctuary Gulch had shifted.
and it had shifted on the strong back of one small, resilient horse. The desperation in the county was a palpable thing, a sour taste in the air. Silas Blackwood was a man besieged. The ranchers who had paid him fortunes for breeding stock that was now dead or dying were starting to ask for their money back. His reputation, the bedrock of his empire, was cracking. He needed a solution, and he needed it fast. He needed a new story to tell, a way to co-opt the success that was now radiating from Alara Kane's humble homestead. His first move was subtle. He began to speak of the importance of hybrid vigor and outcross breeding, terms he had previously dismissed with contempt. He talked about the old, hardy Mustang lines as a valuable genetic resource, conveniently forgetting he had advocated for their eradication for years. He was trying to rewrite the narrative, to position himself as a visionary who had always understood the value of what Alara possessed. His second move was less subtle. He sent one of his foremen, the same man who had sneered at frostbite in the vet's clinic years ago, to Alara's fence line. The foreman didn't come to the house. He parked his truck down the road and, under the cover of dusk, crept along the perimeter of her pasture with a pair of binoculars and a notepad. He was counting. Finn saw him. The boy had an instinct for things that were out of place, and the sight of a Blackwood Ranch truck parked half a mile away set off an alarm in his head. He didn't confront the man. He slipped back to the barn and told Alara, his voice low and angry. "He's counting them, Alara. He's counting the yearlings." Alara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the cold arithmetic of greed, preparing its attack. She knew then that a confrontation was inevitable. Blackwood wasn't going to ask. He was going to try to take. The stage for that confrontation turned out to be the Sanctuary Gulch annual cutting trials. It was a social and economic highlight of the year, the place where reputations were made and broken. Alara had never entered before. Her work was done in private, her successes banked low. But this year was different. This year she had something to prove, not to them, but for herself and for Frostbite. She entered one of his sons, a compact sorrel yearling with his father's intelligent eyes and his mother's calm demeanour. Finn had named him Ember. On the day of the trials, the air was thick with tension. The stands were packed. It was the first major gathering since the plague had swept through, and the mood was sombre. Silas Blackwood was there, a judge's ribbon pinned to his lapel, his face set like stone. He was trying to project an aura of unshaken authority, but his eyes betrayed a deep anxiety. When Alara and Finn led the small sorrel colt into the warm-up pen, a hush fell over the assembled horsemen. Ember was half the size of the other yearlings, mostly Blackwood stock that pranced and fretted around him. He looked plain, almost common, next to their polished coats and refined features. Alara heard the snickers, the familiar whispers, the blizzard widow and her runt. Some things, it seemed, died hard. Then came the competition. One by one, the expensive, high-strung colts were brought before the judges. They were fast, they were athletic, but they lacked focus. They fought their riders, they were spooked by the cattle. Blackwood's own entry, a magnificent bay he had been boasting about for months, disgraced itself by trying to climb the fence. Finally, it was Alara's turn. She nodded to Finn, who led Ember into the arena. The colt walked in calmly, his scarred ears, a trait inherited in a less dramatic form from his sire, twitching as he surveyed the scene. When the heifer was released, Ember transformed. He dropped his head and body low, his eyes locked on the cow. The crowd, which had been murmuring, fell silent. What they witnessed was not a contest of speed or force, but of intelligence. Ember didn't chase the cow. He controlled it. He mirrored its every move with an eerie prescience, cutting it off with deft, precise movements, always one step ahead. It wasn't just a horse, he was a partner. The timer's stopwatch clicked, marking a score that was, by a wide margin, the best of the day. The arena was utterly silent for a beat, and then the applause started. It wasn't the polite clapping for a good run. It was a roar of stunned, dawning recognition. They were seeing the answer to their prayers, the living, breathing proof of a way forward. It was in that moment of triumph that Blackwood made his move. He strode into the center of the arena, his face a mask of magnanimous charm, seizing the moment as if he had orchestrated it. He raised a hand for silence. "A remarkable animal," he boomed, his voice echoing across the arena. "A testament to the hardy native bloodlines I've long advocated we must preserve." He turned to Ilara, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Ilara, my dear, you have done a tremendous service to this community, keeping this line safe. In fact, to ensure its legacy, I am prepared to make you a very generous offer. I will purchase this fine colt right here, right now, for $20,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a staggering sum. But it was more than a purchase. It was an anointing. Blackwood was attempting to buy not just the horse, but the story that went with it. He was trying to absorb Ilara's success into his own narrative. He wasn't finished.
He lowered his voice, drawing everyone in, and to form the foundation of a new, resilient breeding program for the whole valley. I will also buy the other 5 yearlings you have back at your place. I'll give you $15,000 apiece for them, a package deal, to save our community. He smiled, triumphant. He had laid his trap in public, using generosity as a weapon. How could she refuse? And in his arrogance, he made his fatal slip. The other 5 yearlings you have back at your place. He had just confessed, in front of the entire county, that he knew the exact number of horses in her pasture, a number he could only know if he had been spying. Ilara stood in the center of the arena, the lead rope of the victorious colt held loosely in her hand. The silence was thick and heavy. Everyone was looking at her, waiting for her to accept the fortune, to be grateful. Blackwood's smile was fixed, confident. She let the silence stretch.
She looked at the faces in the crowd, the men who had mocked her, the women who had pitied her. She looked at Doc Miller, who was watching her with a look of profound respect. She saw Mr. Alexei standing near the back fence, his arms crossed, a rare, small smile on his face. And she looked at Finn, who stood by the gate, his young face fierce with loyalty. Finally, she turned her gaze back to Silas Blackwood. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent arena. "Your offer, Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is based on the cold arithmetic of the ledger and information you came by dishonestly." A shockwave went through the crowd. Blackwood's smile faltered. "My price," Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength, "is based on a different calculation. It is based on the warm arithmetic of breath and bone. It is the price of a blizzard and a dying foal and a neighbor's kindness. It is the price of 4 years of work, of rising before dawn, of banking a fire against the cold." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This colt is not for sale to you. Not at any price." She then turned away from the stunned Blackwood and faced the crowd, her real audience. She saw their faces ruined by the plague, shadowed by debt, desperate for hope. These were her neighbors, flawed, weak, and subject to mockery, but they were her people, and their fate was tied to the land they all shared. She held all the power. She could have chosen revenge. She could have named an exorbitant price, making them pay for their years of scorn. But she remembered Alexei's salve, Finn's stolen apples, the quiet solidarity of outsiders. She chose grace. "However," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority, "the sons and daughters of Frostbit are for sale. To any rancher in this valley who needs to rebuild, to anyone who has learned that hardy is better than perfect." She took a deep breath. The price for a yearling colt or filly is $200. A stunned silence, then an explosive wave of murmurs. $200? It was a pittance. It was less than the price of a good saddle. It was barely more than the insulting offer Blackwood had made for Frostbit at the feed store years ago. It was not a price meant to make her rich. It was a price designed to save a community. It was an act of breathtaking generosity, a rebuke to Blackwood's greed so profound it was almost violent. It was the price of a shared future. Men who hadn't looked her in the eye for years were now staring at her with a raw, naked gratitude. Wives looked at their husbands, hope dawning on their faces for the first time in months. The spell of Silas Blackwood was broken. His wealth, his power, his pedigree, it all meant nothing in the face of this quiet woman and her profound act of grace. Blackwood stood alone in the centre of the ring, his face pale, diminished. He had been shamed not by anger, but by a generosity he could not comprehend. He turned and walked out of the arena, a king dethroned in his own court. One by one, then, in a rush, the ranchers came forward, not to Blackwood, but to her. They didn't just want to buy a horse. They wanted to thank her. They wanted to apologize. They formed a line, not a line of customers, but of penitents, of neighbors, coming to the woman they had scorned, who now held the key to their survival. 2 years later, the pastures of Sanctuary Gulch were dotted with tough, intelligent horses. There were buckskins, sorrels, and bays, many with the distinctive, slightly ragged ears that had become a badge of honor, a symbol of resilience. The Frostbit line, as it was now known, had saved the county's horse industry, rebuilding it from the ground up on a foundation of hardiness and sense. Ilara's homestead was no longer a place of solitude. It was the heart of the valley. The barn had been expanded, the fences mended and strengthened. Finn, now a young man of 20, was her full partner, his quiet confidence now a deep well of knowledge. He ran the breeding program, his eye for matching mare and stallion almost as uncanny as Ilara's. One cool autumn evening, Ilara was leaning on the top rail of the corral, watching a new crop of weanlings kick up their heels in the dust. Mr. Alexei, older and more stooped but with the same clear eyes, stood beside her. He had a proprietary air about him, as if the success of the ranch was a direct result of his beat kvass. They watched as Frostbit, his coat now flecked with grey around the muzzle, but his eyes as bright as ever, trotted to the fence. Ilara reached out and scratched his forehead, her fingers tracing the scars on his ears. He had sired champions. He had saved a community. But to her, he would always be the frozen bundle of sticks she had cut free from the snow. Alexei gestured with his chin toward the vibrant, healthy young horses. "You see," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the root is deep, very deep." Ilara smiled, a real, unguarded smile. The accounts of her life, once so devastatingly out of balance, were finally settled. The cold arithmetic of loss had been answered, overwhelmingly, by the warm, enduring arithmetic of a life well lived. She was no longer one person alone. She was the heart of a community, mended and made strong in the broken places.